Okay, so picture this. November 27th, 1980, Thanksgiving Day. Big parade crowd gathered.
Oh, yeah.
Reno, Nevada.
Sounds very festive.
Right, you've got the whole heartwarming scene you expect on Thanksgiving, and then suddenly, like out of nowhere, everything just twists into something completely horrific.
Yeah, talk about a contrast, right? You've got this festive setting and then boom, just this brutal violence. It really makes you think about how quickly things can change.
Absolutely. So today we're going to dive into a story that a lot of people might not be familiar with, Priscilla Joyce Ford. And trust me, this case, it's disturbing, and it raises some really tough questions about mental health and the justice system.
Yeah, we've got a ton of information to unpack today. We're going to be looking at Ford's life before the incident, what happened on that Thanksgiving Day, the legal battles that followed, and what happened to her in the years after. So get ready, because this is a story with a lot of layers and some pretty troubling aspects.
Yeah.
It is.
We're not just going to lay out the facts. We want to really try to understand what led up to that day, explore those questions around Ford's mental state, and walk you through the whole legal process. Our goal is to give you a clear picture of this whole tragic event. So let's start at the beginning. Who was Priscilla Ford?
Okay, so Priscilla Joyce Ford, she was born on February 10, 1929 in Berrien Springs, Michigan. And she was a teacher, married twice, had 3 kids, 2 sons and a daughter named Winter Scott. At first glance, pretty typical life for that time.
It sounds pretty normal.
Yeah.
But when you dig a little deeper, things start to get a lot more complicated. There's a really big event in 1957 that kind of stands out.
Yeah, absolutely. So in 57, Ford, she actually shot her second husband. Now, investigations determined it was self-defense, there were reports of abuse, but then right after that, she shot herself too. She survived, thankfully. But, you can already see there's a lot of personal distress and a history of some volatile situations.
Right, and unfortunately, that wasn't an isolated incident. Our sources indicate a long history of serious mental health struggles.
Exactly. She was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia, and her diagnosis specifically mentioned religious and violent tendencies. She was hospitalized and treated at 7 different facilities before she ended up moving to Reno in 1980. That's a pretty clear sign of a really tough battle with a serious mental illness.
Yeah, it's really important to keep that in mind as we go through the events of Thanksgiving Day.
Hmm.
Oh, and one more thing about her. She was a heavy smoker and later developed emphysema, which sadly would eventually be a factor in her death. Okay, so with that background, let's go to that fateful day, Thanksgiving 1980 in Reno.
So the setting was the annual Thanksgiving Day parade on Virginia Street, packed with people, families, everyone out to enjoy the holiday.
And then this unthinkable thing happens.
Yeah.
Ford is driving a 1974 Lincoln Continental, and she drives it right onto the sidewalk, straight into the crowd. It's just awful. The car traveled about 100 feet through all those people.
The impact was devastating. 6 people were killed and 23 others were injured. It's hard to even imagine the scale of the tragedy.
And then there's the aftermath. When the police got there and told her to get out of the car, Ford was described as being really calm. She didn't resist arrest at all. It's almost chilling to hear she was so calm. Does that tell us anything about her mental state at the time, or is that just speculation?
It's tough to say for sure, but that lack of any strong emotional response in such a horrific situation, it could suggest that she wasn't fully grasping what had happened.
Yeah.
It could be a sign of her mental illness altering her perception and reactions.
Right, and she told them her name, Priscilla Joyce Ford, said she was new to Reno. Just moved there that year. Tests showed her blood alcohol level was 0.162, way over the legal limit. And then there's these really disturbing statements she made. She was told that 5 or 6 people were dead, and she just said, good. And another officer said she was heard saying, the more dead, the better. Those are some seriously scary insights into what was going on in her mind.
It's incredibly unsettling, especially knowing about her paranoid schizophrenia and the violent tendencies that were part of her diagnosis. It makes you question whether she understood the weight of her actions, the value of human life at that point. These details, along with her history of mental illness, they obviously raised huge red flags for law enforcement, and that's what set the stage for a very complex legal case.
So with her history, a mental evaluation was a top priority.
Oh, absolutely. And on January 29th, 1981, just a couple of months after everything happened, Ford was found incompetent to stand trial.
Can you quickly explain what incompetent to stand trial actually means?
Sure. So it basically means that because of a mental illness or some other cognitive impairment, a person can't understand the charges against them or help their lawyer defend them. In Ford's case, it was her severe mental illness that led to this finding.
So because of that, she was taken into custody and sent to Lakes Crossing for mental health treatment.
Right. They started her on medication to try and stabilize her condition and help manage the symptoms of her schizophrenia. And it was during this time that she started having auditory hallucinations. She said she was hearing voices like Joan Bennett Kennedy and Barbara Walters. It just shows you how serious her condition was.
But that finding of incompetence wasn't permanent, was it?
No, after some treatment and evaluation on August 4th, 1981, she was declared competent to stand trial. It goes to show that mental competency isn't fixed. It can change with treatment and as the illness runs its course.
So when the trial finally started, she pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity. And that's what set the scene for this really long and important legal battle.
It was a huge case. The trial went on for almost 5 months, the longest one in northern Nevada history. The jury was made up of 7 women and 5 men.
And Ford actually decided to testify in her own defense.
Yeah,
And from what I've read, her testimony was pretty remarkable.
it definitely was. She claimed that she was the reincarnation of Jesus Christ, and because of that, she couldn't sin. This goes right back to those religious delusions that were a big part of her paranoid schizophrenia. It's fascinating and really sad to see how her illness manifested in such a profound and disturbing way.
So let's talk about the arguments that were presented during the trial. Her public defender, Lou Carnahan, he had a tough job ahead of him, didn't he?
Absolutely. Carnahan's whole defense was based on Ford's extensive history of mental illness. He argued that giving her the death penalty, someone with such a long and severe mental health history, would be a huge injustice. He wanted her to be sentenced to life in a mental institution where she could get ongoing care and treatment. He probably brought in her medical records, expert testimony, all to prove just how chronic and debilitating her condition was. He was trying to show that her actions were a direct result of those delusions, not some rational criminal intent.
But on the other side, you had District Attorney Cal Dunlap, and he painted a very different picture for the jury.
Yeah, Dunlap, he went with evil personified. That was his angle. He basically argued that even with her mental illness, she was sane when she drove into that crowd. He wanted a conviction and a harsh sentence. It's such a stark contrast to the defense's portrayal of her as this severely mentally ill woman. How did the prosecution even reconcile her history with this idea of pure evil for the jury?
Well, they probably argued that even though she had a history of mental illness, she was aware of what she was doing when she committed the crime, that she intended to do it, and that even with her delusions, she was still legally responsible for what she did. They might have even brought in their own psychiatric experts to argue that she was legally sane at the time of the crime.
So after almost 5 months of testimony and deliberation, the jury reached a verdict.
On March 19, 1982, the jury deliberated for 13 hours and found Priscilla Ford guilty on 6 counts of murder and 23 counts of attempted murder. It's important to note that while 7 people died because of her actions, there were some issues with the indictment, which is why she was only charged with 6 counts of murder.
And the sentencing phase came pretty quickly after that, right?
Yeah, just a little over a week later, on March 28, 1982, the jury had to decide on the death penalty. And they voted for it. It was a huge decision, obviously, and it caused a lot of debate, especially considering Ford's history of mental illness. It's hard to think about someone with such a documented history of mental illness being sentenced to death. It really makes you question how our justice system handles these incredibly complex cases.
So what happened to Ford after the death sentence?
She spent the next 20 years on death row at the Southern Nevada Women's Correctional Center in North Las Vegas. It's a very isolated and restrictive environment, and as our sources suggest, it can make existing mental health conditions even worse.
And even though she was sentenced to death, she didn't stop fighting it legally, right?
No, over the years, she filed a bunch of appeals challenging the death sentence. It's pretty common in death penalty cases as the defense tries every possible legal option.
But none of those appeals worked, and she stayed on death row for the rest of her life.
Sadly, Priscilla Joyce Ford died from emphysema on January 29, 2005. She was 75 years old. She was still on death row when she passed away. It was a progressive lung disease, probably caused by her years of smoking.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into this really disturbing case, what are the key takeaways for our listeners?
Priscilla Ford's case is a tragic example of the connection between severe mental illness and violence. And it shows how complicated it can be to navigate the legal system when someone has a long history of mental health issues. Of course, at the center of all of this are the victims and their families who went through unimaginable pain and loss. You've now heard a lot about this horrific event from Ford's troubled past and what she did to the long legal process in the years she spent on death row.
It's a case that raises big questions about how we determine guilt when mental illness is involved. With her history of paranoid schizophrenia, it forces us to think critically about how our justice system treats people with serious mental health problems